The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Hey, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. As Drew said, my name is Adam Moore. I'm currently engaged as a learner at the Canadian Defence Academy doing professional development for a year, and it includes being hosted by the CIDP as a visiting research fellow from the Canadian Armed Forces. It's my honor to moderate Panel 5 this morning. As some of you may recall, Dr. Lynch yesterday gave a great introduction to what Panel 5 is like. And that moderating the last panel of cases comes with its own unique set of challenges. And I suspect this is why Howard asked me to moderate panel number 5. I think he knows I don't have any problem asking the obvious question when it's needed and take that burden off of somebody else. Today's panel is centered on evolving approaches to human security, and we have a fantastic lineup of speakers. I'm excited to introduce them briefly to you. First, Dr. Caitlin Casson is a sessional professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. Her expertise spans global citizenship, cosmopolitanism, the security development nexus, and humanitarian action. Today, she will explore the evolving world order and its implications for traditional ideas about human security outcomes. She'll be followed by Dr. Michael Rostek, a retired member of the Canadian Armed Forces and a visiting Defense Fellow alumnus. Dr. Rostek brings a wealth of experience in academic and military settings. He is currently a defense scientist with the Director General Military Personnel Research and Analysis within DNDCAF and works with General Bourgon's team. His presentation will, I am told, touch upon cosmopolitanism, an area of common interest with Dr. Casson, and we'll pull on a few of the threads that Professor Paris introduced yesterday. And apparently, I'm told we'll give the definitive answer to Colin McGee's questions. Dr. Rostek will be followed by Dr. Ian Gardner, the assistant professor at the Center for Totalitarian Studies at the Pilecki Institute in Warsaw, Poland. He is a specialist in Russian and Soviet military culture and propaganda. And using this expertise will offer us a vivid and tactile exploration of today's theme, analyzed through the ongoing Ukraine-Russian war. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you our first speaker, Dr. Casson.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So I'd like to talk today about interoperability in post or non-liberal intervention environments. And I was speaking with someone out front before coming in here, and I'm fearful that I'm reaching past my scope here in a room of such varied expertise. But I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm going to try to resist the academic tendency to raise issues and pose excellent questions, but stop short of offering solutions or even attempting to offer pathways forward. And I am going to try to do that. I'm going to try to point to some potential solutions or at least paths forward and move in the direction of the how of human security, especially amidst changes in the world order. Okay, let me see if I can get, there we go. Okay. So I don't want to get too deep into theory because I think at this point it's not too useful, but I do want to at least be clear on what I mean when I say world order, so that when we discuss the implications of changes in that order, we're on the same page. So world order essentially is the structure of international relations. It's how relationships between states are managed, how disputes are navigated, how power is distributed, and how communications and collaborations are organized. So really, you're just looking at that bottom point, the takeaways on that slide there. You can ignore the rest. So usually, especially when I'm teaching students, I say that the best way to understand the principle of world order is to do it through a quick historical kind of timeline to apply it and see how it's manifested over time, and also to highlight that what we're seeing right now, it's not the first time that the world order has changed, right? It has changed many times throughout history. So to begin, historically, it was a multipolar world order, right? With multiple sovereign states all operating on roughly equal grounds and wielding power in the international system. This transitioned into a bipolar world with two sovereign states principally wielding power in the international system, again, roughly equally with various dispute management mechanisms. And here, of course, we're talking about the Cold War. Then, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, it became a unipolar or liberal world order, led by a single sovereign state as hegemon, principally the US, with liberal values, norms, and institutions such as democracy, individual human rights, capitalism, and security, enjoying near universal buy-in. There's broad agreement that this world order is currently collapsing, or maybe it already has. Most scholars date this collapse to the War on Terror and US unilateral action in response, which bypassed the UN Security Council and NATO, and thus undermined liberal institutions and norms that they represent. There we go. So today, the evidence of disorder in the world, or what our friends in chemistry or the hard sciences might call high levels of entropy in the current system, includes the rejection of liberal values and governance structures, as exemplified by terrorist actions and non-state armed activity, and deep social conservatism amongst a variety of groups around the world. Several contemporary examples of the rejection of international law and norms, including multilateralism, the non-use of force, the inviolability of sovereignty, human rights law and international humanitarian law, and rejection of international institutions and organizations, exemplified by the proliferation of mis- and disinformation campaigns, the closure of several peace operations, and the general loss of appetite for large boots-on-the-ground interventions. So the question is, where are we headed? What will the new punctuated equilibrium, to use Roland Paris's language, or the new world order look like? Ultimately, I don't know, and neither does anyone else, right? The system is evolving, and what's on the horizon is widely debated. Maybe we're seeing a return to realism, where states behave in ways that maximize their military, political, and economic power in order to assure their state security principally. Or perhaps we're seeing a new world order emerge. Perhaps it's a return to multipolarity, but with different sovereign states occupying the poles, likely the US, Russia, China, and India, perhaps. Maybe it's something more profound, a shift in how power is wielded, not only by states, but also by other actors like private companies and non-state actors, and the coexistence of different systems with different values, norms, and understandings of legitimate governance. Regardless, what we know for sure at this point is that democracy is no longer the only or dominantly legitimate form of governance. Capitalism and free trade is still mostly the dominant form of economy, though with some actors engaging in more state-level direction than others. Human rights and international law are understood differently and valued differently depending on which actor we're talking about. And the core organizations of the liberal world order, the UN, the EU, and NATO, are no longer as legitimate, powerful, or unifying as they once were. For liberal actors like the UN, NATO, and Canada, I'll highlight two major implications that emerge from the disorder in the current international system. Firstly, these shifts will likely demand a different scale and perhaps depth of cooperation and collaboration. So in order to work with new partners and new actors, both local or domestic and international, who potentially have different goals and understandings of what the desirable end state of an intervention is, envisioning something different than a democratic state supported by institutions, public accountability, human rights, and free trade. This will move the discussion about comprehensiveness, integration, and harmonization beyond its current use to reach an ideological and normative level. Secondly, as Marian Lawrence reminded us yesterday, and as I think the rejection of the liberal international system demonstrates, human security is malleable and contested. As such, I think these shifts in the international system will generate risks and compromises with respect to the human security agenda. So, what does this mean for those states, organizations, and militaries rooted in liberal values, human security norms that they still want to protect and promote in the world? So as we were reminded several times yesterday, human security incorporates three elements: freedom from fear, freedom from want, and dignity. From a liberal perspective, dignity is achieved through human rights and democratic representation, right? Having a say in one's government. From a non-liberal perspective, dignity might mean something very different. As such, protecting and promoting human security in a post-liberal world will likely require some degree of normative flexibility and a high degree of collaboration. This normative flexibility will present challenges for strategic planning and for organizational autonomy and values. So how do we equip military and civilian personnel for future interventions in this context? We need repeat and continued interaction. So with new, emerging, and prominent actors in the New World Order, it's not just about NATO, the EU, and the UN anymore. We need to get to know and learn to interact with and cooperate with the African Union, with the Economic Community of West African States, with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, among others. Sometimes that may not go very well. It might be too high of a risk, or it might be too high of a compromise. So we may need to move towards strategic partnerships, taking up piecemeal approaches, focusing on particular issues when we agree with local and national authorities, and collaborate while turning a sort of tactical blind eye to the ways in which we disagree. Here we might see the proliferation of what John Carlsrud and colleagues at NUPI are terming ad hoc coalitions. We need to continue to cultivate a culture of cooperation where not only Canada, but also the US, NATO, and the UN truly understand that they can no longer act alone with legitimacy or authority in a complex, diverse, and disordered system. Concretely, and building on insights that are now over 2 decades old, we need locally led, locally coherent, and locally legitimate approaches. For actors like the UN and liberal member states like Canada, this may be usefully pursued by fundamentally realigning how we understand our role in conflict response to be centered on support of locally designed plans, priorities, and actors, rather than things like capacity building, values promotion, or power maximization, and so forth. Interoperability in this context will require competencies in diplomacy, bargaining, negotiation, and interactive problem solving, communication, civil-military coordination, including information sharing and management. And to tie in our colleague Madeline's point about informational bottlenecks yesterday, and to include insights of my colleagues at the Peacebuilding and Local Knowledge Network, we need to get better at synthesizing information and without losing that complexity, ensuring that the right voices are in the room when decisions are made, and managing, distilling, and moving information through the appropriate and relevant channels in digestible and usable ways. Finally, in a post-liberal intervention environment, liberal actors will need to realize and unlearn their assumptions and privilege, seeing the ways in which our relative comfort and security in the global north or west is a product of and sustained by inequalities in the global system, finding ways to train individuals across the intervention landscape to engage in a post-colonial systems perspective will be productive in collaborating with greater normative flexibility. This may also be supported by improving intersectional diversity in our armed forces. The future of interventions, regardless of what version of the world order emerges from our current state of disorder, will likely require a high level of adaptivity and relationality. This poses challenges with respect to risk tolerance, reliance on templates for action, and remote management of operations. So again, how do we equip military and civilian personnel for adaptive and relational interventions? As noted on the previous slide, we need better information management, including improved feedback mechanisms. As always, we need longer, more flexible funding cycles to achieve adaptivity and relationality, as well as more frequent and participatory assessments and evaluations. So earmarking funding and infrequent top-down assessments make interventions unresponsive to the needs and realities on the ground. Holistic funding mechanisms and participatory assessments allow for the best bottom-up processes and approaches, which have the best legitimacy and sustainability. Controversially, promoting and protecting human security in a disordered world may in fact require much higher risk tolerance, on the part of liberal actors like the UN, NATO, and Canada. If we no longer can assume that a liberal, democratic, market-oriented state is the goal, we need to talk to people and work with people to find out what the goal of an intervention is or should be. This will require less bunkerization and increased contact with host communities. This echoes Walter Dorn and Joshua Libben's call for soldier diplomats in 2016, individuals equipped with communication and relationship skills fit for purpose, but also expanding the space available for improvisation and creativity. To make this level of adaptivity and relationality possible, cultural awareness training also must be expanded, nuanced, and go beyond insights like not to offer your hand to Muslim women and things like this. We need to know how people communicate, how communities relate and interact to one another, and how societies are structured, ordered, and how stability is maintained every day. Ambitious? Yes. Feasible? Maybe not. Probably lots of you are thinking never. Necessary? I'd argue yes. I think probably it is going to be necessary. If the collective we, the we of the global north, the we of the liberal world, the we of the human security perspective, want a role in the future of conflict response and human security protection and promotion, we need to figure out how to function and operate in different ways. Ways that make our efforts more legitimate, sustainable, contextually appropriate, and locally rooted. My takeaways for this presentation are a call for adding diplomacy into the roster of mainstreaming. So not only do we need to mainstream gender and mainstream environment, we also need to mainstream diplomacy vertically, horizontally, inwardly, outwardly, militarily, and in all of the civilian components involved in foreign policy and conflict response. In order to support the everyday peace and local forms of order that help conflict-affected societies function amidst precarity, we may need to embrace the entropy and ad hocism that the system generates in order to allow creativity and solutions to emerge and be identified from the bottom up. Ultimately, this is a constructivist approach to action on human security in an uncertain, disordered, and differently ordered future, suggesting a series of sort of training related or bureaucratic recommendations to prepare highly structured and ordered actors like international organizations, like militaries, to work alongside actors both internationally and locally with divergent values, governance systems, and visions of dignity and the good life. If we need a nice realist rationale to sell everything that I've been saying, ultimately finding ways for entities like the UN, NATO, and Canada to promote human security amidst a disordered, potentially post and non-liberal system is an essential component of state security. Because again, to cite Madeline in a conversation we had yesterday, human security, meaning freedom from fear, freedom from want, and dignity, is essential to battling disenfranchisement, which often leads to radicalism, populism, isolationism, and all of these nefarious forces, both internationally but also domestically. Thanks very much, and much of this work comes from collaboration with my colleague Benjamin Zyla at the University of Ottawa. Thanks.
Well, good morning. It is indeed a pleasure to be here and to sit up here. So many years I've spent sitting there. I think I was here at the inception of this conference way back in the early 2000s. And so this forum has always been held near and dear to my heart. And this is the first time I've ever actually been at the head table up here speaking. So it's really an honor for me to be here. I'm going to talk today a little bit about what Roland Paris eloquently referred to as the zombie concept, R2P, as it's known today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to touch back to that. I also want to point out that very much at the time when I was doing this research, that R2P and human security were seen as twin concepts, or at the very least, they were cousins. And I am almost certain that I will get the award during this event for the busiest slide, and which is fine, because when you're trying to condense a PhD dissertation into 15 minutes and 15 slides, it can be a challenge. So Vanessa, I empathize with your concerns in the last panel. I would like to point out by starting off that the views and the conclusions here that I express are my own. They do not represent those of DRDC or the Canadian Armed Forces. So this is the agenda that I'm going to follow today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context with which we find ourselves today, the antecedents for my research and why I got involved. I'm looking at military models that prioritize human security as a concept. I will state right up front that they are theoretical concepts and theoretical constructs. I will look at the moral and physical and conceptual domains in order to sort of better understand and communicate to you exactly how I approach this problem. And then I look at measuring diffusion and salience for R2P and human security, what are largely considered at the time as emergent international norms, and how they affected state militaries. As proclaimed by Mary Kaldor, author of the book New Wars, human security is in the air. Recently, human security has been receiving growing interest with the defense community, which has been aptly communicated during this conference. The current security environment and coincident re-emphasis on human security, brought about by the deliberate targeting of civilians, the continued use of child soldiers, and the use of conflict-related sexual violence as a deliberate tactic, among other issues, establishes the demand for a closer look at the military relevance and scientific research relevant to the utilization and implementation of human security. Indeed, for the first time, the explicit call for the integration of human security considerations has appeared in Canada's most recent defense policy update, Our North Strong and Free. During the 1990s, state-based militaries around the world were transforming themselves to take account of the emergent security environment, marked by increasing volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, also characterized as VUCA, or known as VUCA. During that period, globalization and the withdrawal of the Cold War overlay, I'm talking about the 1990s again, converged, resulting in a complex phenomenon known as we all know, failed and failing states. In turn, new wars, characterized by the many humanitarian crises during that period, emerged with this environment as a threat to international peace and security, leaving the international community with the dilemma of whether or not to intervene. Within this environment, the human security emerged as the most comprehensive and multidimensional referent for security alongside that of the state. In 2001, the responsibility to protect emerged as one of the most controversial and difficult international relations dilemmas. That is, external military intervention into a state, a sovereign state, for human protection. Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Rwanda, and the controversies that surrounded those operations fueled in part the Government of Canada's decision to lead the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, whose final report was titled The Responsibility to Protect. It is within that context that I began to research how international security norms impacted the Canadian Armed Forces. Using a norms and normative theoretical approach from international relations theory, I began to investigate how R2P and human security might affect the Canadian Armed Forces. Part of my journey involved research regarding the abolition of African slavery led by the UK, which you heard Roland talk about yesterday. So I'm not going to repeat the details, only to say that the Royal Navy at the time, because of the normative change within the UK with respect to the abolition of African slavery, became an anti-slavery international police force. And this intrigued me. And so as a result of that, I went after this idea of how these changing contexts, these changing norms can actually affect state militaries. My initial involvement with these models began with the Cosmopolitan Militaries Project in 2002. As a directing staff at the Australian Defence College, I was approached by the Canadian High Commission to participate in a project with Drs. Graham Cheeseman and Lorraine Elliott. Graham Cheeseman is from Australian National University. Lorraine Elliott is from Manchester University, and they were the authors of the concept and the book on the slide before you on the left. And I got involved with them at the request of the High Commission, and I was intrigued by the idea that state militaries could be conceptualized as what we call forces for good under cosmopolitan theory, and published a chapter in the book indicated on the slide with which I concluded that Canadian Armed Forces was, at the time, a cosmopolitan-like military. Continuing with my research, I investigated the Human Security Response Force. That was Mary Kaldor involved with that, and UNEPS, United Nations Emergency Peace Service, Dr. Peter Langille is the author and moves that concept forward to this day as they too converge on normative characteristics with respect to the use of force. That is, the primary focus of their operations is to defend individuals. This underlying normative trend is closely associated with the emergent regulative international norm R2P, which is underpinned by human security. Each of the models ascribe to the notion that security is no longer solely about state security, it's about human security also. A cosmopolitan military's purpose is to defend the moral community of humankind. The Human Security Response Force attempts to capture the essence of emergent security environment based on human security principles, and the United Nations Emergency Peace Service's purpose is law enforcement and the protection of innocent people, not territorial conquest or to vanquish a foe. The convergence of these distinct models around human securities is indicative of the strength of the idea that militaries under specific circumstances could be used for purposes as those postulated within the emergent R2P doctrine. To understand the theoretical models better, I turn to the concept of military power that essentially defines what a military is. Military power is the potential of military capabilities that a nation possesses and the international reputations those capabilities have on professional fighting forces. The overall concept of military power can be viewed as an essential mix of interrelated components, physical, moral, and conceptual. The physical components are the actual means to fight. That's the equipment, to paraphrase. Moral component is concerned with the persuasion of people to fight and recognizes that it's people who realize military power. And the conceptual component provides the thought process required to develop, generate, and employ military power. I would like to acknowledge at this point a book that has been on display here called The Evolving Human Security Frameworks and Considerations for Canada's Military, edited by Shannon Lewis-Simpson and Sarah Jane Mahar. And that book, actually, there's a few chapters in there written by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Lambert that actually tackle these issues, contemporary, Canadian doctrine. And I think it's really good. I think he did a great job. And if you want to know more about this concept and what they mean today, I would recommend that you pick up that book and read those chapters, about 2 or 3 in there. But overall, it's a great book and a real credit to the center for publishing that. To better understand the physical, moral, and conceptual characteristics for each military model, 10 criteria were selected and analyzed and listed on the slide before you. I was specifically interested in how the theoretical models underpinned by human security might inform state-based military capability development. So state-based, I wasn't looking for international forces. I was looking for and targeting the Canadian Armed Forces as a state-based military. This would allow the use of military force under an R2P humanitarian mandate. At the time when I was doing this work, I was in concepts development with the Army Warfare Center. So I was at the forefront of any new concept that was coming out, any new ideas, and they were crossing our desk in my organization, which is now called the Army Warfare Center. And so I was at the cusp. And the interesting thing about that time and about my research was that there wasn't a whole lot that came across my desk or came into the organization that explicitly targeted human security as a capability. We talked about it a bit here, but there was 3 full paragraphs in peace support operations doctrine, which I don't think exists anymore. And it's been replaced by something else. But at the same point, I spent more of my time during that period in DFATE, now Global Affairs Canada, than I did with my military members, trying to get a handle and get an idea on this issue of human security. This is the busy slide I was talking about. Don't worry, these will be made available. So this represents the analysis of the military models across the 10 criteria. The aim was to develop a greater understanding of each of them and dig deeper below the surface. For example, the cosmopolitan military I considered representative of more of a state-focused, and its primary role while the primary role of the military, defense of the state, was not contested, cosmopolitan authors argue that the state militaries can be used to defend the moral community of humankind. The Human Security Response Force, representing more, for me, a regional focus with the EU, articulated human security as well as a state security should be the foundation of new EU policy. the United Nations Emergency Peace Service, more of an international focus, reinforced that the idea of a rapidly deployable force with a first responder philosophy, and as many of you will be aware, this concept has long roots with the UN going back into the 40s and the 50s. The military model assessment provided greater insight into what type of military might be used to support an R2P mandated mission underpinned by human security. In addition, I was trying to determine if the analysis could possibly assist with the operationalization of R2P, which remains the doctrine's most controversial and difficult component. The fact that these models were being discussed and debated within academia and other institutional platforms, such as the United Nations and EU, indicated that normative change regarding militaries and the use of force was being considered, even though there was no clearly defined movement towards implementation of these models within state militaries. The one exception, if you will recall, was the creation of Sheerbrig, the Standby High Readiness Brigade, a Danish-led initiative that was associated with the UN. Aimed at and created from 1999 to 2009. They were besieged by a number of deployment possibilities, and I think at the end of the day, their only one deployment was a small team into Africa. I can't recall where it was. There was a few other notable references in this regard, also from the Netherlands, who wrote a report on a UN Rapid Deployment Brigade, and Canada actually published a report in 1995 towards a rapid reaction capability. Each of the model's moral, physical, and conceptual domains converged around a number of issues as listed on the slide before you: rapid deployment, greater integration of military and civilian personnel, new education and training standards as represented by the soldier diplomat, the soldier security officer, this sort of thing. And soldiers motivated by a sense of accomplishment that exists beyond the defense of the state. The convergence of these distinct models around human security is indicative of the strength of the idea that militaries, under specific circumstances, can be used beyond, again, state security goals. New international norms have must have strong diffusion pathways. That's how they make their way into the state, and must achieve salience, how they achieve constitutive effects, to achieve that exalted, taken for granted status. That means they're not contested, or they're minimally contested. Norms are notoriously difficult to measure due to their intangible nature, and the norms, diffusion, and salience literature provides a means to actually measure these. In order to assess the diffusion and salience of the military models, I used a multiple methods approach to develop the criteria on the slide before you from international norms literature. And you can see the diffusion and salience measures that I looked at. In essence, the central question for me remained: how do international norms make their way into the state, and how they achieve constitutive effects within the Canadian Armed Forces? As mentioned, diffusion measures on the slide before you were adapted from norms literature and international relations, and the key norm diffusion authors, I won't list their name, but they are from the international relations discipline, essentially established 4 complementary pathways for these norms to make their way into the state through rhetoric, domestic interests, domestic institutions, and socializing forces. So I adapted the 5 measures that you saw in the previous slide from this discussion and applied them directly to the Canadian context. Based on the above analysis, it should be no surprise, I guess, but it was a little bit to me at the time. It was assessed that UNEP's model demonstrated the most significant progress within the diffusion process, and thereby positioning itself as potentially the best model to enact a R2P or human security mandate. Further, I developed criteria for domestic salience in a similar fashion, using scholars from the international relations theory, concluding that salience literature converges on 3 basic criteria: political discourse, state policies, and national institutions. Using the conceptual content analysis of public documents, I explicitly searched for R2P and human security across the 3 criteria, and specifically the change in the language on the slide. I can actually point to the exact moment that Stephen Harper stopped using the term human security. It was May 2006. As I was tracking their speeches, both foreign minister and the defense minister on the language and the lexicon that they were using, and which was really interesting because you had a conservative government using a liberal created policy, which was very interesting to me. So I borrowed measurement descriptors from Cortell and Davis, again from that talked about high, moderate, low, and not salient measures of the norm. My analysis discovered varying degrees of diffusion and salience of each military models with states and within states in the international community. There were signals in academia, international organizations, and non-governmental organizations concerning the use of military force for the purposes other than state security. At the time of writing, it appeared the CAF were not quite ready or willing to adopt a human security focus, as evidenced by the Canadian discourse that did not translate into explicit changes in state institutions, namely the military. They did change foreign policy, but they didn't actually make their way into the defense through, and I measured this through the CAF doctrine that was extant at the time. So at the time, I concluded that consideration should be given to possibly converging the military models to sort of enhance the domestic salience and diffusion processes, thereby allowing for human security to take a greater hold in the Canadian Armed Forces. But I also stated at the same time that states must revisit the normative underpinnings suggested by the models and their human security focus in the future, given changes to the international security environment. So I actually wrote that in my dissertation. And so this is largely why I'm here today, because I was moved by the panel last year in this forum on human security. And I said, oh, wait a minute, maybe I have something to contribute. And that's when I approached Howard and we talked about this and probably why I'm sitting here today. So in my concluding remarks, in the past couple of years, we have witnessed a renewed focus on human security as evidenced in the NATO security concept, the UN Secretary General, in his human security report, Canadian defense policy. I'll reiterate, that's the first time it's ever been explicitly articulated in defense policy. And I was also quite taken by the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security and the Dallaire Center of Excellence for Peace and Security as markers that look at, whether or not we're moving in the right direction. Through a norms and normative theory approach, these would be considered diffusion and salience indicators, signaling a move towards a greater human security focus. In particular, as already mentioned, I'm going to restate it, the first time human security was mentioned in defense policy. It's never happened before. And the Dallaire Center of Excellence for Peace and Security and their development options for integrating human security into the CAF, as mentioned by Colin McGee yesterday with his panel, certainly signals a move towards a greater acceptance, or at least listening to the ideas, the concept of how to move human security forward. So perhaps, just perhaps, it may be the time to have a look at the military models again and try to understand them and see if they might contribute to that movement or that operationalization of human security for the Canadian Forces at this time. Thank you.
Okay. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Wonderful. So thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here, although I'm going to talk about a very miserable topic, and a topic that doesn't have much positivity, I think, in the future, regardless of peace deals that might be signed over the next few months. And I want to maybe add some perspective through this case study of looking at Mariupol, the fate of Mariupol, and the way that Mariupol is discussed and engaged with by Russians, by the state, and by ordinary Russians online, and give a little bit of perspective to some of the discussions we've been having around misinformation, disinformation, truth. R2P is about to come up in a certain sense, and indeed this sort of breakdown of the bipolar and singular world order and the ways that Russia is now trying to engage with those discourses we've seen. And you're all very welcome to email me. I apologize. This is very small and I have the world's longest email address. But if you want my card afterwards, then I will give it to you. One of the many reasons, and of course, some of them have been rather contradictory, the Russian state has given for its intervention in Ukraine revolves around this comment that Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, made at the UN back in 2022. The goal of our actions is to save people by fulfilling our allied obligations, as well as to, and you've all heard this, demilitarize and denazify Ukraine so that such things never happen again. And on the surface, this just, it just looks absurd, right? But consistently, the Russian narrative has been that the war is about saving Ukrainians who are really Russians, ethnic Russians from a genocide that is purportedly being carried out against them, but also about saving Russians themselves in Russia, because Russia is under attack. And we've seen that this week in the discourse around ATACMS and escalations in the war, which are supposedly, putting Russia itself on the brink of destruction. I think you're all expert enough to know that a few dozen ATACMS is not going to end the Russian Empire after several hundred years. But in reality, we know that the way that Russia has conducted the war has done anything but saving Ukrainians and saving Russians. So this is Mariupol today, or relatively recently. And the invasion reached Mariupol very quickly in 2022, and very rapidly, I'll give you the statistics: 7 hospitals, 57 schools, 70 kindergartens, 61,000 apartments and homes, that's 85% of the city's housing stock, and tens of thousands of civilians were killed. We don't know the number of civilians, it's impossible to ascertain. There are various estimates, but the number is big. And what followed during the occupation was not the cessation of violence, but the continuation of violence, and it continues today. Deportations of children, women, supposed traitors, enemies of the state, torture, rape, kidnap, the establishment of filtration camps, and a hollowing out of the city. And that has continued to the extent that in the occupied territories as a whole, the population before the war was something like 6 million, and today it's closer to 3 million. Over the last year, another 100,000 people have either left or been killed. And so Russia continues to destroy. Its mission to save is obviously a fantasy. And this sort of war doesn't really make sense, right? We've seen it before. We saw it in Chechnya in the 1990s. They attempted it. They did it again in the 2000s when they raised Grozny, again under the pretext of rebuilding Russia. But what's even weirder when we think about what's happened during the war is that Russia itself has come under attack, right? And we all know that what's happening in Kursk, drone attacks in Moscow. Just the other day, another 34 drones hit Moscow itself. 5 people were injured. We've seen more incursions in Belgorod, other areas along the border, Russians dying, not to mention, of course, the something like 80, 90, 100,000 Russian troops who've been killed or invalided out of Ukraine. So this war is not just ripping through Ukraine, it is ripping through Russia as well. And yet the public seems utterly apathetic to this. Drone attacks in Moscow go pretty much unmentioned and undiscussed. And it would be easy to attribute that to simply oppression. But in reality, we know that there are plenty of avenues, in particular online, where Russians are able anonymously to discuss these things. They're discussing other aspects of their dissatisfaction with life in Russia, but they're not talking about this. They're not talking about attacks on Russia. So I want to figure out why, and I'm going to show you why and the ways that they're engaging with the war and the ways that the war is actually saving Russia purportedly by looking at Mariupol. And to understand that, now luckily Thomas did a lot of the heavy lifting for me this morning by pointing out that Russia long has been and remains a colonial power. But I think the thing that Thomas didn't mention is that part of the narrative of Russia's colonialism has long been, as it is for many other colonial powers, the idea that by engaging in building colonies, the country is engaging in civilizing the territories that it's invading and seizing. Bear this in mind as we go through and look at the ways that the state has discussed Mariupol subsequent to seizing it in spring 2022. Because one of the things that is very strange, if we think about Russia as a colonial power and this is a colonial war, And if you're interested, Ksenia Aksamitna at City University in London is one of the best thinkers on this, and she has some nice short texts that aren't too densely academic if anyone wants to read something. Is that there isn't much colonization happening. Very few Russians actually going to move to Mariupol, and I'll explain more of what this looks like in a second. Now, immediately after seizing Mariupol, the state constructed a grand new reconstruction plan for the city. Putin declared he wanted one as early as March 2022, and just a couple of months later, the apparatchiks had scuttled off and done some thinking and come up with some very grandiose ideas about what the city would look like as it was reconstructed. The intent is that by 2035, they're pouring trillions of rubles. That may have to get bigger as the ruble suffers, but vast amounts of money into not just rebuilding the city as it was, but turning it into what they call an all-Russian city, by which they mean a better city, something that's even better than what exists in Russia. It is meant to become a model of what it could be like to be Russian. And Putin himself talks about Mariupol as an inherently Russian city. So on the Day of National Unity, which is this big national holiday in November 2022, he went to one of the monuments in Moscow and he made a speech, and it was mostly about Mariupol and the occupied territories. And he made this comment: Mariupol is famously an ancient, and I have to say, a Russian city. And then he highlights Mariupol's destruction. He highlights the suffering. And this is important, because what I'm about to point out is that there is no attempt to highlight this, to hide the scale of the destruction in Mariupol. In fact, on the contrary, it is repeatedly highlighted by Russian political actors, in media discourse and online. This is not censored. It's important. And here, Putin points out why. The destruction was necessary. Mariupol suffered greatly. It was necessary to build new schools, homes, and kindergartens. We had to destroy it to build back bigger and build back better. And this discourse has been accompanied by a huge amount of articles in the media in which Russian state propagandists and journalists, some of them in mainstream media, some of them bloggers, influencers, go to Mariupol and talk about what the city is like today. So this journalist, Grigory Kubatyan, went for Komsomolskaya Pravda, which is one of the tabloids over there, and wrote this very long article that had this subheading: Mariupol is arising from the flames like a phoenix. Mariupol is growing, but of course, like the phoenix, it has to be in the flames before it can get that big. And it was accompanied by something like 12 to 15 photographs that quite frankly highlight this juxtaposition between destruction and recreation. And so here, this is the drama theatre in Mariupol. And you can see it's being reconstructed. This is a busy site. But there is no attempt to hide the fact that here this is destroyed. And there is no attempt really to blame the destruction on Ukrainian forces. It's left unspoken. It's not said that we destroyed it, but it's pretty obvious. There's no attempt to lie about what happened. And then you get pictures like this in these articles. Look at this. We've built this fabulous new apartment block, and here is a Russian, ethnic Russian as they're called, couple, Vanya and Masha, I don't know who they are, who talk about how wonderful life is in the new Mariupol, and how everybody spontaneously sings the Russian national anthem every night before they go to bed. I'm not making that up. That actually is in the article. And then this is one of the classic images that has been used time and time again in these articles, of which there are so many. The Mariupol city sign on the city limits at the top. This is the sign painted out in Ukrainian colors, and with the Ukrainian eye you can see in the middle there. Well, now that eye has been swapped out and it's all been repainted in Russian colors. And yet what's interesting about this picture at the bottom is that you can see the destruction there, right, on the left-hand side, on the column. There is no attempt to pretend that this is some kind of wonderland. In terms of the actual physical settlement plans, well, colonization is meant to be a part of this rebuilt Mariupol. And according to the plan, there are going to be 300,000 Russians settled in Mariupol by 2025. And they're being tempted there by cheap mortgages. Purportedly, you're meant to be able to get a 2% mortgage rate if you buy a property in Mariupol. And that's quite something when the mortgage rate from the central bank just last week has gone up to 28.4% in mainland Russia, which is not great if you thought that your mortgage didn't look good. And by cheap property. You know, this is the rhetoric of classic colonialization, virgin lands, go over there, buy stuff up cheap. But the reality is a little bit more complex. And so far, bear in mind that 2025 is, about 40 days away, less than 80,000 people have actually moved in. And almost all of those are temporary workers from Central Asia who are being brought in to do reconstruction work. i.e., they're there not for the long term. This is not Russian settlement. They're there for a little bit, and then they're going to go home again once they've got their paycheck, or they're going to go to Russia itself, where pay is better. Russians themselves aren't buying property in Mariupol. And most, or a lot of property transactions in Russia are advertised in online groups on VK, one of the major social platforms over there. And when you look at the property groups for Mariupol, there are very, very few members. Even the biggest group I could find only had 5,000 members, which in a platform that has 90 million people using it regularly is not very many. And even those members are not looking at these groups and engaging with them. So on that particular group, Недвижимость Mariupolia, the average view count for a post was less than 10. So nobody is looking at these properties. Part of the problem is that they're actually extremely expensive. The cheap property does not exist in reality. The average property price on that group advertised when I looked over the last few weeks was about $60,000, which for Russia is expensive. This is not bargain basement property. And yet the state isn't really doing anything to correct this. It doesn't care. It's not doing anything to draw Russians in. It's building a little. It's building some facilities. So what's going on? Well, here is what's going on. The idea of rebuilding Mariupol, the idea of reconstructing Mariupol isn't real, but it serves a particular political purpose. And here Putin says in 2023, and this was an internal meeting with some of the heads of the occupied regions in Ukraine. He says that when people read about Mariupol, everybody should feel mobilized. Everybody should feel as if they're on the front line. The idea is to engage people with the war, to make them feel excited about it. But what does that excitement really look like? Well, I would argue that Mariupol is intended as a kind of a simulacrum of reality. And I'm going to try not to get too dense and theoretical here. But Mariupol serves a function, and these images of Mariupol serve a function in society of reinventing and saving Russia itself and Russians themselves, not Ukrainians at all. And so when we look, for example, at the way that the reconstruction of Mariupol is discussed by ordinary Russians online, where there is a huge amount of sort of glamorous, sort of soft focus, Instagram style real estate videos and investment videos about how wonderful it is to buy property in Mariupol. Those videos are published and go viral, and there is a huge amount of excitement about the idea of them, where people chip in and they say, this is great. This is awesome. I can see myself living in Mariupol. But they're not going to move there. They're not doing it. They don't want to do it. They're bonding around the idea that Mariupol represents something. And the platform to do this is online, where reality doesn't matter as much. And I want to give you a particular example of how this functions that is this sort of purely bizarre constructed narrative. And this is Nastya Ivleva, who is a sort of all-purpose Russian influencer and TV celebrity. One of those people you can imagine. She's huge in Russia. She's incredibly popular. She was everywhere for a while, up until New Year's Eve, when Nastya made the grand misstep, transgressive misstep of hosting a so-called almost naked party to celebrate New Year's Eve with a bunch of other Russian celebrities. And it was a sort of bacchanalian orgy of celebrity stuff that nobody would even raise an eyebrow at here, but the Russian press picked up on and said that this is everything wrong with Russia. This is transgenderism, this is Satanism and paedophilia. This is the West. This is an attack on Russianness. And again, I'm not exaggerating. These are close paraphrases of what they were saying. And so poor Nastya Ivleva got an absolute kicking in the press for a couple of months. Somebody even tried to sue her for 1 billion rubles for, just some random citizen for sort of, personal offense. How did Nastya get back into the good books of Russian society? Well, she went to Mariupol. And then here she is, appearing on an extremely popular YouTube channel in Russia. Again, very youth-focused, very friendly, very appealing YouTube channel. And what does she say in this interview? The sort of part celebrity interview and part Soviet-style self-flagellation and confession. She says, when I went to Mariupol, seeing how a new life is being born among the ruins was a unique sight. It left a deep impression on me. Mariupol is where new life is. She goes on to say, I'm a reformed character. Thank God I went there. I'm Russian again. I'm reborn. There is a strange sort of commercial religiousness to these discourses as well. And what was the response to that? Among these communities of nationalists and patriots and Russians? Well, they hated Nastya before. They never loved her very much because, she's youth, she's crass, she's Westerner, she used to date a very controversial rapper. But now, Nastya has turned into our Svyatynya Rus, into our holy Rus, holy Russia. We love Nastya. She's one of us. And so here, Mariupol serves the purpose, regardless of the destruction, of giving Russians a means to imagine not a civilizing process occurring in the colony, but occurring for them at home. And that has some alarming repercussions, I think. First, that destruction isn't undesirable. Destruction is fine. You can destroy as much as you like, and you can still be saving. But also, when we think about misinformation and disinformation, and this is my last comment, and it is going to be theoretical, I apologize. I don't know if anybody has read Baudrillard's Simulations, but on the very first couple of pages, so you've only got to read 2 pages to understand this bit, he points out there is an old Borges story in which there is an empire, and the empire attempts to build a map over the top of the empire that is the size of the entire empire, and that it is going to be glittering and beautiful, and it's going to replicate the empire and sort of, crown the empire. It's going to be the cherry on top. And yet the map starts fraying, becomes tattered, and nobody notices. And Baudrillard says, well, in the era of virtual realities, things are going to be inverted. But the virtual reality will still exist, and we won't notice the tattered and fraying reality underneath. And here is what is happening in Russia. We can engage, Russians can engage with this virtual reality. They can construct a sense of the self online in these communities by engaging with these narratives, all of which are fictional. Yes, it's misinformation, it's disinformation, it's full of lies, but not really pay any heed to the destruction of Ukraine and not pay any heed to the attacks on Russia itself and the fact that Russia is worse off today by almost any measure than it was 2 years ago and that it was 10 years ago when the war against Ukraine began. And that's all I'll say. Thank you very much.